Hi everybody. I'm Erica Lehrer. I'm the principal investigator of the Thinking Through the Museum Research Network. I think I know most of the people here, but no, I think there are a couple of new faces, which is wonderful. I'm really thrilled to welcome people to what is our first public workshop. So we're in year 2 of a 7-year project, and this is the first time that we have begun opening workshops up to the general public. So it's a wonderful way to grow, and it's really great to see new faces. We actually have, this is the beginning of a series of workshops, and we're planning on doing many more. So we have actually a couple of other workshops coming up this winter semester. And Alex Robichaud, who is our tech guru behind the scenes, our project manager of Thinking Through the Museum, will put some information in the chat in a moment if people are interested in signing up for other workshops that we have coming up. For today, I'm going to make this really short, but we're really thrilled to have our guests, Jonas, Tinius, Margareta von Oswald, and Lynhan Balatbat-Helbock, presenting their Awkward Archives, a modular curriculum. I've had a chance to poke a bit through the book, not to engage as much as I yet want to, and I'm really excited to see it in action. We're really fans of this kind of resource that can be used for teaching and to stimulate new ideas about engaging with awkwardness, which is, of course, given that we have our project has many people who also have a long connection with CARMA, the Center for Anthropological Research on Museums and Heritage in the Humboldt University at Berlin. We're really happy to be connecting with you all through that, especially around the notion of awkwardness, which is a deep shared interest, especially for myself and some of my colleagues in Poland. So I won't say more than that. I will hand the floor over to our guests, who can introduce themselves and get us rolling with today's workshop. So over to you all, and thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erica. Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you so much for organizing this incredible workshop. We're really, really glad to be here, and it's a really incredible pleasure also to be presenting our book here for the first time after it has become available online. So, and we are also especially happy to have this conversation in this context, because it continues discussions we have had in Berlin last September in a workshop on awkwardness that was organized by Erica Lehrer, Roma Sendika, Magdalena Waligowska, who's also here actually sharing the office with me, Magdalena Zig, and Wojciech Wilczyk. Welcome you all online. We're very happy that it will be a kind of workshop. So we will also, in the course of the 2 hours, be able to work in smaller groups together, get to know each other a little bit, and explore this topic of awkwardness together. And of course, we are also really happy to welcome Lynhan Balatbat from Savi Contemporary here with us today. We will be hosting this workshop together. My name is Margareta von Oswald. I'm a research fellow at the Institute of European Ethnology here in Berlin. And more particularly, I'm based at the Center for Anthropological Research on Museums and Heritage that Erica already mentioned. And basically what we're going to focus on today is our book, Awkward Archives. And this book grew out of fieldwork we did on museums and curatorial practices in Berlin, while being in the research project Making Differences at Sharon McDonald's CARMA, which I just mentioned, the Research Center for Museums and Heritage. So one outcome of this research, which kind of acts as a prequel to this book, was the open access volume Across Anthropology, which you can see on the slide, which we co-edited with Leuven University Press, and which traces the ways in which anthropology has been problematized beyond itself. So in the summer of 2019, the program director of the long-term program, The Whole Life, an archive project, which kind of lasted from 2018 to 2021, so Stefan Auer was his name, asked us to join an experimental collaborative research initiative. And initially we were invited as conveners of their second academy, but due to our existing research commitments, we decided to reshuffle and propose an ethnography of the second edition of the Whole Life Academy, which was a whole program dedicated to archives. So in the end, this kind of project transformed into an ethnography of archiving practices in Berlin, moving thus outwards to encompass the Haus der Kultur in der Welt, which is the institution that kind of initiated this research as only one of the several archives we would explore as part of the book Awkward Archives that we will get more into detail in the following minutes. So when we decided that our fieldwork curriculum could become a printed modular toolbox, we approached Chiara Figone from the independent publishing and curatorial platform Archive for evident reasons, and our initial proposal turned into an entire series. The conceptual and practical basis of the series is the notion of the nomadic curriculum, developed and practiced within the Whole Life Academy. It includes 2 other volumes, or rather 3, 2 of which from the same editorial collective Kafata, and another one by Beatrice von Bismarck, a professor of curatorial studies in Leipzig. All of these are available online, and you can obviously also order them in print. So the book we want to introduce today, and also keep it rather short, is because we will give also quite a lot of space to Lynn to kind of dive into one of the modules of the book. It's called Awkward Archive, Ethnographic Drafts for a Modular Curriculum. And it offers precisely what the title says. So it is a series of 7 modular drafts, which we have not ranked or ordered in a particular way, that function as both portraits of and toolkits for thinking about how to study archives. The focus is on archives in Berlin, so that the case studies we chose can both document but also complement possible similar archives elsewhere and can be used in comparison. Moreover, we chose to focus on archives that we call awkward, which Jonas will get more into detail right now.
Yes, good morning also from my side, or good afternoon. It is very early here, so I have to move my hands because the office light actually just turned off, so don't be confused by that. Thanks, Margareta, for this first introduction. Now into the book itself, as it were, into the argument. So our approach to archives includes a shift from this understanding of archives as repositories to archives as subjects, which means for us see them as sites of intervention, activation, and documentation. It also means that our work on them remains, as it were, always necessarily a draft, because we're working in a changing and emerging present, which is open to being worked on, to be changed, and of course to be commented on and criticized by our interlocutors and the people in the archives, the objects, the subjects that we work with. For us to work and to focus, and this is very important about this book, in Berlin was itself a challenge, but also something that we wanted to really highlight in this book, because Berlin itself is an archival city. We chose to use this kind of phrasing because what makes the city particular is that, of course, its history is composed or constituted by 2 former states, basically observing one another, affecting the way in which archives emerged during, but also after the former East and West division. So the archives we worked on are firmly situated within and marked by this turbulent legacy. Now, again, the slides don't change. This is great. Anyway, I'll just continue explaining to you. The archives we chose reveal, in our views, awkward, that is to say, difficult problems, and cause disquieting frictions. And with Anat Singh, we believe that these frictions, awkward, unequal, unstable, and creative qualities of interconnection, arise because the archives we chose reveal some of the pervasive mechanisms of modern ideologies that sit uncomfortably in the contemporary world. So we worked directly with archive producers or archivists with whom we discussed how their own discomfort became a productive and troubling heuristic. So our curriculum highlights the archiving troubles, the awkward labor that archivists invest when working against normative categories, shifting across binary taxonomies, translating analog into digital data, analyzing photographs that go against their politics, or storing objects they find appalling. What we understand by awkward, thus, is about implication and about conflict. So Lynhan for instance, and this was actually one of the starting points really for, for us to start thinking about this term, when describing the Colonial Neighbors Archive project that Savi Contemporary featured in one of the modules, referred in one of our earliest conversations on this, as the collections and as some of the items as garbage, that is to say, as difficult things that one doesn't maybe even want to see. And she raised, by saying that and by doing that, the question of how to curate difficult, everyday racist commodities from the German colonial era. So these items thus, implicate spectators and users in moral dilemmas of judgment and responsibility.
So what you are supposed to see is a table of contents to kind of get an overview of what's in the book. So as we said, the book is devised as a draft for a modular curriculum. So it is modular insofar as the chosen archives form the basis of seven modules that introduce and address central modern ideologies through the lens of awkward archives: freedom, colonialism, folk, property, nature, and sexuality. So in total, the book allows for a semester-long course with the introduction outlining the overall conceptual take and each module offering a double seminar session. Every module emerges from a conversation, followed by working material in the form of references, visual constellations, and a methodological exercise for the seminars. Interviews form part of fieldwork methods, and we encourage teachers and students to use these conversations as methodological exercises in eliciting a practice and understanding the subjective dimensions of archiving processes. How these modules are arranged and added to depend on where, but also on how this curriculum is put to use. We envisage the curriculum to be used in university seminars and settings, but hope that it speaks across different disciplinary contexts, including also museums, art contexts, art schools, etc. Furthermore, we propose the curriculum as a possible toolkit in practice-based situations or other learning contexts beyond the universities, such as exhibition-making processes in curatorial contexts, practices of archiving, or reflections on how to approach, study, or even create an archive or a collection. So the module Freedom is the first module in this book and features an interview with Bernd Scherer, who used to be the director of the House of the World Cultures, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt in Berlin. And this module introduces an institution which has almost no archive, but which is nonetheless in the process of archiving itself and reflecting on what it means to create an archive, or whether some of its documentation can be considered as archival practices. The module Colonialism, which we will get more into detail in a second, focuses on the Colonial Neighbors Archives project of the art space Savi Contemporary, founded in 2009. And Lynhan will explain more in detail what it's all about. The module Folk concerns the photo collections that constitutes the Hanne Niehoff archive at the Humboldt University. We are in conversation with the anthropologist Franka Schneider, who worked on the research project Photo Objects. These photographs were collected between 1920 and 1945 as part of a prototypical photographic form of ethnological volkskundliche knowledge production. The archive pursued an explicit folkish perspective and strategy by providing evidence for the apparent continuity of the Nordic Germanic folk in affirmative but often innocent visual material. So as you can see, it's mainly images of laughing people in festive situations. We discuss how to see the absence as a trace of violence and how to read the materiality of photographic archives. The module Property highlights the work of the Restitution of Knowledge Research Group, which analyzes the narratives and actions of the German punitive expeditions in colonial Africa. Cultural historian Jan Legal tells of the gaps in the archives and collections of museums, from which he and the research team put together traces to reassemble the past of the expeditions. The archive is in the making and consists, among other things, of long Excel lists putting together the scarce information on objects purchased, looted, or stolen for German Ethnological Museum. The module Nature brings into focus the processes of digitizing the collections at the Museum of Natural History in Berlin. Anthropologist Tahani Nadim, director of the Humanities of Nature department in the museum, discusses her inquiry into the new troubles that emerge and gaps that persist when translating analog specimen into zeros and ones. And finally, the module Sexuality traces the emergence of the Naomi Wilczek art collection and its transition from Miami Beach in Florida to become part of the collections of the Humboldt University in Berlin. Anthropologist Hannes Hacke, who oversees the process, speaks to us about the creation of new queer taxonomies. So you can download the book, as the link is already in the chat, and now and we encourage to pastiche, remix, and reuse this book as it offers itself. And now over to Lynn for a presentation on the Colonial Neighbors Archive.
Hi, thank you for this. I just wanted to mention, Jonas, you have forgotten to introduce yourself. In case, because we just missed it and I didn't want to interrupt you. Maybe you still want to introduce yourselves, or we do it in the end?
I'm very happy to keep it very brief. Hi, I'm Jonas, anthropologist, used to work at CAMA with Margareta, now writing up a book on museums and curatorial work, and currently at UCLA, where I see Sylvia Forni, who actually is the director of the Fowler Museum just opposite my department here, who got up at this inhumanly hour as well. So I'm very grateful you're there. Nice to see you. Thanks, Lynn. That's very kind of you. I'll switch over to you. Do you want me to share the slides for you, or do you want to switch over to your presentation? I'm sure you're technically more advanced than I am, very clearly.
I can try to share my screen. I just have it here. Let me see. Can you see?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. I don't know if it translates good morning, good day to you. Definitely to you, Jonas. Good morning. It's my pleasure and absolute joy to be part of this workshop. Thank you again, Margareta and Jonas, for inviting me to be part of this beautiful compilation of essays. So as Jonas and Margareta already mentioned, I work in Slavic Contemporary, which is an art and cultural space in Berlin, Germany. And I joined SAVI in 2013 via the Colonial Neighbors Archive project. Just to give you a background, I did see this open call to join an archive project, and I thought, wow, again, you want to talk about colonialism in the heart of Europe? Have we not heard enough? And then I understood it's more about the stories behind the objects than having this goal to talk again and to explain. So just to tell you also, we're not historians, we're not pedagogues who try to deliver what colonialism is. So I give you a brief round of how the project started and what, so to say, the objectives are. So this archive project actually started in 2009, initiated by Bonaventure Sobing Dikung, who was the founder and director of Slavic Contemporary. It started with this album. So basically the grandmother of his wife found this album in the attic. And she said, hey, this is a photo album and it says Cameroon. And you're from Cameroon, maybe you're interested in it. And basically the images in there, they're taken by her uncle, who was for a year in Cameroon. And it's quite an innocent picture album, so to say, where he kind of documented his journey whilst in Cameroon. So all the descriptions are quite innocent, like fruits in lands, this and this people, dances, but clearly in the background of the images you saw spaces of violence. So Bonaventure said, hey, okay, this came randomly into my hands. What else is there, like in the attics, in the cellars in Germany, that's connected via their own family history towards the colonial period of Germany? So here you see an installation shot that we had in our archive. These were around 8 from 25 heads, Bismarck heads, that we reproduced on the course of a performance. So Savi was situated in Berlin-Neukölln, just for you to also see more or less the packaging, the container of the archive. So this was our second space, and we have moved now to Berlin-Wedding. I mean, I guess most of you know the former colonies, but other than also some smaller colonies in the Pacific, the main colonies on the African continent were Togo, Cameroon, formerly Deutsch-Ostafrika and Deutsch-Südwestafrika, Tanzania and Togo. Here you see some other objects that we have in our collection, which are like these picture albums. I don't know if you remember, like these albums where you could, I think nowadays you have them too, where you can purchase some stickers and stick them in your sticker album. And this one says here, Deutsche Kolonien. So just to share as well, like what kind of objects we have. So here we have beer coasters, we have books, games, all kinds of cans, tins, memorabilia. Here you have a necklace. I don't know if you can see it. This is a jute sack, and here's an ivory necklace. So the objects that we have are all donated, and we ask the giver what's the story, what's the connection to it. And this necklace belonged to an artist, Emily Putter, and she came to an opening and mentioned that she had this necklace in her family over like 4 generations. It was handed down from the women, and then she never questioned this necklace because it was just handed down from her grandmother to her mom to her. And then she thought, okay, it's made of ivory, and her parents had, like her family had stories and history in Cameroon. And she said, this must come from a violent background. And the moment she was aware of that, she really wanted to dispose of it because she didn't want to have anything to do with the history of violence. And it doesn't stop there. So you give it to an initiative, you give it to someone, but you need to activate it. So basically we invited Emily as well in other formats to still like think about her family history or this narrative that she's disconnected from, but still connected to. Here you have different objects. Here you have the Sarotti pralinen box, which Sarotti is a brand of chocolate, and they used to have a factory in the so-called M Street, and they used to have the pictogram of a so-called Moor. And obviously people criticized them for the racist image, and then they changed it and kept the silhouette and said, it's a magician now. But so basically nothing has changed. Here you have a letter with, I don't know if you can see it. It says Solidarität mit dem Volk Namibia. So solidarity with the people of Namibia. And this is Berlin. Can you see it? I can't read the time, but this is basically from the GDR time, which is also a very complex time, because on the one side you had a strong notion of solidarity with resistant movements on the continent. At the same time, there was a weird nostalgia for the lost territories, extended territories of Germany. I just wanted to share also some quotes that inspired our archive, or the way we want to archive here by Membe. So we thought about an archive as conservative. So the usual formats of archives, the way they also discriminate, and through their selection, inspired by Membe when he says, the archive therefore is fundamentally a matter of discrimination and selection, which in the end results in the granting of a privileged status to certain written documents and a refusal of that same status to others, thereby judged unarchivable. The archive is therefore not a piece of data, but a status. So we thought about this process of archive making. How do we want to archive these violent objects? And as Jonas so beautifully mentioned in the former conversation we had, I asked him, like, you know, at the end of the day, archiving is a format of care. But how to care for objects that I described as shrapnel, because, you know, a lot of these memorabilia and post-war trinkets, they remind me of something that you need to dispose of, you know. And if it was up to me, I would get rid of half of it in a performative act to kind of free us from this violent spirit. But it's not my archive, it's made by the people, and it's also for the people. Oops, sorry. Okay, here you see also ways how we try to install and make the archive accessible to the public. So here we had a very simple format where we had an overhead projector and we had empty foils, and we invited the visitors to sketch out and a way they find dignified to approach these objects that carry violence in them. And here you have some boxes. So it was a very cheap way to also try to make people understand that it's up to them to also like interfere, not only with the way things are being presented, but also how to see things. So you can shift, you know, the gaze and close things away, or put them down, or take them out of the box, or of course take something out and engage with it. Sometimes we simply put things also on the table, and for people to just take it in, you know, take something off the table, look at it, take it into the hands, because we said it's very important that you're able to touch something, to take it and make it your own and hold it. This haptic moment where you touch an object and are closer to it. Then we also thought about accessibility, and we thought about Derrida's quote here. There's no political power without control of the archive, if not memory. Effective democratization can always be measured by this essential criterion. The participation in and to the archive is its constitution and its interpretation. So in order to question also, you know, like in what we're trying to do is not to accumulate something that has the label colonialism or violence, because at the end of the day, it's worth nothing if you have all these drawers, pornography, science fiction, colonial trinkets. It's very easy then also to kind of like dispatch things. We just wanted to also connect towards people's memory in order to connect people to a certain period of time, and not think about colonialism as a grand evil that is very easy to point back in time and say, back then this and this happened, and now we're in this moment of where we're conscious about the dynamics and like the evil format of colonialism, and now we're here to discuss this, but it's more about thinking about the future and how people will point a finger on us and think, how can they basically also be silent bystanders in the sorry, I'm still ill, in denying others people right to mobility. So we really try to make this fragmented map of colonial history and how people are connected to this collective memory. Sorry, one second. So we also say it's very important to also activate this archive, and we can't simply collect things and just leave them be, but we need to activate them through performances, through workshops. And if we try to address gaps in education, social sciences, politics, we really need to do our work. And one way is to also invite schools and school classes to rethink via, be it cultural appropriation in fashion, or sorry, or the curriculum, etc. Here we with a school class from Kochschule Modestraße, Modeschule in Berlin, where they worked with us on a 2-day workshop where we also visited different tailors, thought about patterns in fashion and colonial legacies in fashion. So here, I'm not going to read the long quote by Arjun Appadurai, but we thought about the archive as a tool of intervention as well. When we talk about the collective memory, we also are very aware how fragile our memory is. And basically, if we're just in exile with our history towards an object, it's very easy also to keep a wrong memory towards something, because a lot of times we also have people with good intentions, but that remember things in a very racist way, and they shelter this this memory towards an object or the family history. So one way to activate the archive as well is via the fragment series. In the fragment series, we invited artists to take 1 or 2 objects and in their own individual practice engage with that object. And the first artist we had was Tito Aderemi Batola, an artist from Nigeria, who in one archival display mentioned, this is an awful space, because I feel as a Black woman stripped of my dignity if I see these objects. So a lot of times we're challenged as well how to present objects without necessarily censoring them, but without perpetuating this violent image, for example, on a packaging material, etc. So here in the fragment series, we did a devised theater project where we, in an open call, alongside other participants, rehearsed for 6 weeks and talked about our own ghosts that haunt our bodies in regards to trauma, dispossessed land, applying for refuge, etc., etc. It was quite intense, but also beautiful to see how, as much as we have different contexts, different struggles, there are a lot of patterns of violence that are still shared, so to say. In the second archive fragment series, we had Abri Fourie, the South African artist, who kind of answered in a group show. So we had a group show at Savvy Contemporary called Polish Colonialism, which was a group show going from this magazine Morze i Colonialism, which is the sea and colonialism. And they had this self-analytical approach. How did Poland, how did they try by building another port down south from Danzig when they lost it in the war, and thinking of in this attempt to go on and colonize other lands in order to emancipate from this gaze from the West that they are the East. And then we said, okay, fair enough that you try to deal with this dark period in time, but also to say that on the other side of the sea, which is here, I don't know if you see it, it was a massive image, like 5 meters by 1.5, taken from Cape Town. It's very dark, so you can't really see it. And it's in the evening looking out on the ocean. And at the very back, I mean, you really can't see this image. This is like the sea, and in the very back is this this institution where Nelson Mandela was also incarcerated. And this is a triptychon taken from Gorée Island. This is the point of no return. And here he mixed and matched objects from the Colonial Neighbors Archive, which was a magazine, Kolonie and Heimat, with images he took from a boat ferry going from Europe to Lampedusa. Oops, sorry. So another series was a collaboration with the artist Marcio Carvalho, who, whilst walking in Portugal, in Lisbon with his daughter, and she was around 4 years old, and she pointed up to a statue and said, Dad, who's that? And it was one of these warmongers, and he was very angry that he needed to explain to his 4-year-old daughter that they are still honoring war heroes in the streets of Lisbon. So he thought about an intervention, a series of performances in Lisbon and in Berlin, to have this echoing performance series to kind of undo the spirits of these monuments in performative acts. I think I need to be careful with the time to not overgo. So here we have the second intervention, which was Nathalie Mbabikoro, who did write imaginary letters from the daughters of the colonizers. And here's my last slide. So basically, this is also in the book. I don't know if you had a chance to look into the chapter, but this is an installation view by the artist Henrike Naumann that she had in Savi Contemporary, and it was called Toxic Cultural Collection. And she thought more about, so Henrike Naumann is an artist who maybe 20 years ago would print out in a provocative way a swastika to think about the right-wing heritage that was and is lingering in Germany. And now she would shift it, and she would maybe, she says, maybe it suffices to put a vase that has this spirit, this fascist spirit in it, for people to understand, like where this lingering fascism is still here amongst us. And so she thought about the Colonial Neighbors Archive and very prominent and obvious racist images, and thought about everyday objects that have this spirit in them. And she thought about objects that we find in like flea markets or see on the street. And it's more about these racist objects that are dislocated from this manufactured context. So in this context of this workshop, for example, we very much understand like how we see things. But maybe if you're at your aunt's house, or if you go to a store and buy toys for someone, like a friend or your own kids, then the context is not so clear anymore. And she said, like, it's more about thinking about objects that are not this exotic other, but it's more about the racist hour. And she just gathered objects that have this inherent evil, fetishized spirit in them. Yeah, and I think I'll stop here. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions.
We just thought, Lynn, I mean, maybe we can moderate this kind of like final discussion together in some ways, because we are a little bit advanced in time. And what we thought was that we would mix a little bit comments that arose in these breakout sessions, you know, thoughts that you brought in about the objects you brought, about the curation of these objects, with comments or questions that you may have had about the book in general, so that we kind of do this as a mixed session. Yeah, we'd be very curious to hear from you or from some of you to share any type of thought.
Also, I wanted to open up as well if there are any comments or questions in regards to also Jonas and Margareta's book, or also what I just presented about colonial neighbors. We can also we can take some questions beforehand before we talk about our objects.
Absolutely.
Jonas and Margareta, I'm actually curious whether, is this the first sort of workshop you've done on this book, or have you already done workshops with many people? I'm just curious, maybe you could start us off by saying what's come up if you've had some conversations around it.
No, it's our first workshop. We're like really working it through. We're going to have a seminar that comes up where we actually put it into practice. So kind of trying to really, put it in action, the whole book in Berlin. So we're going to explore with the students the different archives, and we'll visit them, and then also possibly meet the archivists that we talk to. But with regards to kind of taking it elsewhere, so what we're trying to do today, we haven't done a workshop like this before.
I mean, that's not entirely true in some ways, because it has had a little bit of an awkward, birth story, this book, in some ways, because we decided, as we told you, to work deliberately with Archive, which is a fantastic platform if you don't know this organization yet, because it's really more than a publisher. It's its own curatorial platform with a really politically progressive agenda, exactly, thanks for the link, and a publishing house and curatorial platform that has worked a lot with Savi. There's a dedicated book series with all the Savi publications on their exhibitions with Archive. And Chiara Figona, the publisher, is really somebody who, is somebody who doesn't just think about books as objects, to read, but she was really somebody who was very keen for us to think, like we were saying, with publishers about ways in which we could print a book that would have thumbnails, so you could easily thumb to the different modules, something that has, a spiral, so it does have this workbook feel to it, a book that costs 12 euros and is downloadable as well, so that was something which she was happy to support. And also working with designers that don't come from the usual design pool, but actually are invested in these types of questions. So this is really important for us. But of course, as you may have noticed, there was paper shortage and all kinds of troubles if you're working as an independent small publishing house. And so the book is the print version has been a little bit delayed. So we've had some presentations of the book without the book beforehand. But we can't wait to actually teach it in a full semester-long course with international students at the Humboldt this coming semester. So that's a little bit the backstory to it. But today we're putting it into practice. I think Hugo, you raised your virtual hand.
I did. And thank you for the presentations and for the discussions. Like thinking on the background of the book and what you're doing today, I was wondering if you can tell us more about how you discussed the idea of awkwardness. Like, I guess it was like an important discussion in your, like in the making of all this process. And it seems like it is an notion that we can agree with it on some particular meaning, but at the same time, it's very like liquid and open. So I was wondering, how did you resolve that conflict? If you, in the case, if you saw it as a conflict, maybe not necessarily.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, this was actually at the heart of this workshop that in some ways also was another platform in which we discussed the book that Erica and colleagues put together in Berlin, which was more specifically about the relationship of awkwardness to Holocaust memory and Holocaust art and object. So of course that had a very specific, as it were, focus. We were inspired. Maybe I can start this, and then you, Margareta, can pick this up, because we're very interested in the discussion of this term, which is really more than a term. In some ways, it began, like I was saying, for me at least, thinking about this with this conversation with Lynn, when in the interview, she was like, "You know what, Jonas, this is just short. This is just garbage." And I was like, "Wait, Lynn, what do you mean? Like, how can we, you don't want to have this, you want to put it away, yeah, but we want to keep it. We need to keep it." So it began kind of with the difficulty of whether to keep or not to keep something. And that turned into something which Emily and Sylvia and I just discussed in our breakout, which is that what's so interesting about awkwardness is it is fundamentally relational and it's fundamentally situated. It's relational because it always relates to something. So awkwardness, it's very hard to be awkward to oneself alone. Even though I could imagine, having spent 7 years in the UK, there are many possible iterations of awkwardness, perhaps also while being alone. So it's relational. It's situated because one's awkwardness is not someone else's awkwardness. What Lynn was describing, depending on who you are, what your experience with racism is, with colonialism is, whether you walk into into a room filled with memorabilia from this time, it may evoke something, it may evoke disgust. Maybe it evokes even warm memories of songs you were singing with I think, Lynn, you were sharing some of these stories in the interview too, with family members, not thinking about these elements. And jump in, Margareta, at any point you want. And I think the last thing that was really important for us is that awkwardness, and that's kind of how it builds for us on the whole discussion of difficult heritage, sensitive collections, and so on. Awkwardness is about moral judgment. And what that means is that, what is acceptable at some time may not be acceptable at another, which means that moral contexts change, and they can sometimes break through. So sometimes we may have something that interrupts, that creates, a moment that we're not ready for. And that's what was interesting to us too, that it's not an easily graspable thing, like saying this is clearly wrong. Lynn, you...
I also just wanted to add, thank you for also explaining further, Jonas. I wanted to say, in our collection, so to say, there are a lot of objects that have this halo around them, like old antique objects where you feel hesitant to interfere. And this is also like an awkward envelope that shelters the object and that holds you captive and prevents you from interfering in an invasive way with the object. And this very superficial way to say this is shrapnel is one way to overcome this this hesitant moment to interfere with this object, because it's in us, your parents tell you don't touch this, it's antique, you'll break it, it's this weird feeling. And I kind of want to overcome this feeling. No, this is violent, it does not deserve to be handled with care. And so I also say that carelessness is one of the tools that I want to use in this archive, because violent objects, they do not deserve this care or this enveloping and sheltering something. Yeah.
I think Erica, you raised your hand, and Margareta too. I don't know.
Please go take Margareta first, and then I'll...
No, go ahead, Erica. I can
There is also no moderator, so I'm just, I'm not taking that role.
I mean, I just wanted to say, because, this is a longstanding conversation that we've been like interlocutors with Margareta and Jonas and myself and Roma Sendika and our research team in Poland. And I can put a couple of links in the chat in a minute of some, how that notion sort of fits into our work with these particular objects of sort of Holocaust related folk art in Poland. But I think, and we've done also some work, and we're in the process because we have a couple of like a volume and a special issue coming out that really try to sort of more deeply theorize awkwardness for our purposes and genealogies of the term. But I think for me, like and from when we had our workshop in Berlin in the fall, we sort of came up with this whole list. I was pulling from all of the different people's papers and realizing like there are so many different but overlapping ways to give this sense of richness around awkwardness. But in like, I think when I just think about it spontaneously, my gut reaction of what the most central and also most useful sense of awkwardness is the fact that it's something that doesn't fit, and it doesn't fit in whatever you can that change. The context can change, right? So it doesn't fit at a certain time in a certain place, etc. But for me, it's been really useful that it doesn't fit in a given, let's say, archival or curatorial context. And once it doesn't fit, what it does, and what's so useful about awkward objects, is that they then illuminate these otherwise invisible systems by the very fact that they don't fit. Because maybe you didn't notice, like no one had mentioned them. There's something sitting on a shelf here that, because it doesn't fit in the given system, right? So the taxonomy of the museum or whatever. And many, we could almost say most of the objects we collected when we were looking for this Polish folk art that registered the Nazi occupation and the Holocaust, you couldn't ask for them directly. And we always found them sort of stuck somewhere else because they didn't fit those taxonomies. So not only did we get to constitute a genre that was inconstitutable before, but it also revealed the fact, and then also with some digging why different facets of these objects couldn't fit into these into these systems, and therefore what was constraining, or what were the ontology of those systems themselves. So that's my favorite part of awkwardness.
If I could maybe, Margareta, you wanted to add something?
No, I just, yeah, if it's directly related to Erica's comment.
Yeah, but very briefly, I mean, there is this, I'm just trying to look up how this, the folktale, The Emperor's New Clothes, exactly, that's what I wanted to look for. So, I mean, Erica, you just, you mentioned something which is so fundamental to what, what we're trying to get at in the introduction too, which is that anytime there is something awkward, it really, as you were saying, it reveals something else. It exposes something else. It exposes generally, as with, difficult heritage or Sylvia, you were talking about silverware and so on, it exposes generally a system of widely held beliefs, norms, values, practices, and so on that have been standard normal science, in Thomas Kuhn's idea, and that are suddenly disrupted and expose a whole way in which, things have always been taken for granted. And so in some ways it is like the Emperor's New Clothes folktale, right? Where the question is, who's the awkward one? Is the awkward one the kid that says, hey, actually, he's not wearing anything, or is it the fact that everybody's always just been assuming the emperor is like well dressed when actually he's been naked? So it immediately asks questions about positionality. I also invite you to look at the quotes of poet Mary Capello that we put into the introduction, because these are really, very, very meaningful to us, where she speaks of awkward as untoward, hard to manage, perverse, something that is on the edge of a table about to tilt over, so there's a tension and energy in this moment as well. But Carl, you raised your hand.
Yeah, to jump in what both of you were saying, it also sometimes reveals something about us and about what our society presumes, this idea that something doesn't fit. I'm thinking about, so I'm doing a research assistantship for a database that is called the Waterloo Cross-Dressing Archives, and it's about articles in the Times in the 18th and 19th century. And every time we talk about this idea that cross-dressing is actually quite common, people feel awkward about this because they wouldn't assume it. And so it actually says something about their gender conceptions and gender norms. But sometimes I was thinking about what Lynhan presented as like tin box and such. And when we talked about object, I mentioned the fact that some of those boxes are still collected. And I was thinking about the fact that whenever someone walk into an archive, they see like these tin box are as archives of colonialisms, the awkwardness would be, I have that in my kitchen, and what does it say about me and such. So I'm thinking that how we enter the archives also sometimes is awkward to us because it reveals our own current issues.
That's a really great example, especially because it's about how the past breaks into the present, right? I actually realized awkwardly that I forgot Margareta, who had added a hand. So maybe with
I think it's
Margareta or
great
Monica.
also people who are in the group, they can speak up. So, and Monica, you wanted to say something. So maybe if it's a
Yes.
flowing discussion, that's the best.
Okay, I just had a couple of comments. One, I just wanted to pick up on what Lynhan was saying about some objects perhaps should not be treated with such care and even destroyed because it invokes Trina Cooper-Bolam's work, among others, on Indian residential schools, and she's working with one of these sites where Indigenous Canadians were forced to go as children, and in really horrific circumstances in many cases, and the dilemma of what you do with these still standing structures. So she's been investigating the possibilities of using projection as a means of providing a sort of cathartic possibility of destroying these buildings. Like, she says, potentially if survivors and their communities would want to burn this building down every night, they could in this kind of virtual way. So there's that I wanted to share. And then I also wanted to note that, I liked Erica's discussion of the object that doesn't fit and the awkwardness, the generative awkwardness of that. But I think the inverse also exists of objects that are so prolific and so, deeply enmeshed in our everyday that we almost become immune to them, and then we don't see sort of what's right in front of our eyes. And of course the we here is very, I say that with heavy quotes around it. But the object I shared is one that I donated to a museum called the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, which is on a university campus in the United States. And it's a daguerreotype, an early photograph of some of my own ancestors who used to perform on vaudeville in minstrel shows in blackface. So, the histories of racism perpetuated in those acts of entertainment, I find quite shameful and painful. And we had this object in my family possession. And for me, that was a really productive thing that I could do with it, because I donated it to this place that is making, I think, some very powerful arguments and interventions around their commitment to anti-racism by presenting this vast collection of everyday objects. And through that, I think they're able to show, to undo the work that often happens with people who want to deny the racism of these objects by saying, oh, this was long ago, or this is just a joke, or this is just this one thing. And so what this museum is doing is saying, no, this is vast and recurring, and these objects from the past are actually being reproduced all the time and sold in gift shops as like fake antiques, and they're still everywhere. So I'll share a couple links if folks are interested.
Thanks, Monica.
I think Shelley wanted to say something. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to add to Monica. I mean, Monica's done writing on this museum, so what I'm adding is what I've learned from Monica's own work about this museum. But I think a really important point about it is I think it is a good example of anti-racist curating, but it's done with such care. It is not just kind of thrown out into the public. It's very carefully. There's a very careful kind of pedagogical approach. So people don't just walk into this archive randomly. They are accompanied, you know, and so that they understand that they're, you know, there's a real sense of intention there, which I think is a really important element of this. Yeah.
Yeah, and if I could just say one word before, you know, it's interesting, Erica, you just posted this comment in the chat. It's multitasking with your running commentary, you know, where you're saying that it's arguably some of our collective work to make things awkward. And I find that an interesting point because, you know, making things awkward sometimes is, you know, is just placing an object in relationship to something else. So in some ways, making something awkward is revealing its awkwardness, you know, or letting the awkwardness come out through a story. Or through just juxtaposition. But Shelley, yeah, you're raising the analog hand, which is even better than the.
No, I'm ripping off of what you're saying because I think it's so exciting, like this idea of making objects awkward. And I wanted to mention that we have an RA on our project who's working with Taz, who's looking at everyday. It's kind of a participatory research project asking people for objects that represent white supremacy. And I think it is a big part of that is like rendering the invisible visible. So I think she's going to really benefit from, she couldn't be here today because of class, but I think she'll really benefit from, I'm glad this is being recorded and everything else. Thank you.
Well, it might be especially interesting for her to look at this archive on folk. And especially that interview with Franka Schneider, because she really, as we were having that conversation with her, you know, we kept looking at, as of course she's done, at these photographs that essentially are, you know, Nazi photographs trying to depict, you know, what sort of a folk could be. But what was so strikingly problematic about them was that there wasn't anything violent in them. You know, as Margareta was saying, it's essentially people, you know, just women, children, smiling and just celebrating and wearing folk costumes and so on. And so it's exactly that which is not yet visible, you know, sometimes that which is not displayed, that creates the certain this sense of here exactly. So this is the quote that we picked out. It is the unmarked that goes unaddressed.
Yeah.
You know, so maybe that's particularly helpful for this colleague.
Thank you.
Erica, I think you raised your hand.
Yeah, I was just realizing when Shelley mentioned our RA Taz, who's working on this project, that because this is recorded and because we want this to be a resource, that actually, much as I love typing things in the chat, it's not that useful because people watching the recording won't have access to that. So I just wanted to read out what I wrote, so it's sort of registered for on the recording. So this is what Jonas was pointing to. I said, it's fascinating how certain objects become awkward and thus visible over time with shifting political and cultural sensibilities, you know, as those things shift. Arguably, making things awkward is the core of much of our collective work, I would say. So, and then the way Shelley re-rendered that, it's like, yeah, in some sense, I mean, that's absolutely how I think of my curatorial work is I am a maker of awkwardness. And, you know, as Jonas said, just by putting things next to each other that are not usually next to each other, and often that can do the job, or sometimes putting a person and an object. So just inviting a new audience to see something that they don't usually get to see, that in itself, like all I had to do was bring, you know, invite Jews into the Krakow Ethnographic Museum, which is an obscure museum that, you know, the sort of global Jewish heritage tourists to Krakow never went in. Simply by inviting them in, the conversation exploded. So yeah, I think that idea of putting things and people in proximity, just simply with a dedicated frame of like saying, this is worth looking at, that can often do almost, you know, 80, 90% of the work for you.
Mm-hmm.
I do wonder, and I struggle myself with the question of the unevenness of the awkwardness, right? Because awkward is a really different word from like pain or horror or trauma, right? And I feel like awkward is spoken from a privileged position of protection in some ways, and I think that can come from different things. I mean, from our own identities and maybe further distance of direct implication. I think also scholarship and studying things and like being a curator and being in contact with these things. So like I'm teaching a class now where I wanted my students to work with some images of African children from the colonial period. And so I had this idea and this exercise and everything. And honestly, when I started getting back into these images, all of a sudden I was just feeling like, whoa, because I have a very diverse class with several students who are from different African countries themselves. And it really gave me pause to think about what it meant sort of ethically and emotionally to introduce these materials as a requirement. And I was also kind of shocked and disappointed in myself that it seemed so belated that I was kind of questioning this. So it's very much still in process, and I had to really sort of backpedal in a way. And I'm not at all certain that the way that I'm handling this is the best, but it's just to kind of underscore the deep challenges, I think, of working with these materials and the very uneven impact that they make.
Yeah, Shelley, it seems like that's a direct response.
It is, I'll echo that. I had a similar experience in the classroom, Monica, where essentially I decided to cancel a debate that the students were going to be participating in, because I realized that one side of the debate, the language and ideas were incredibly sensitive and potentially very harmful for some students in the class. And I just realized, like, I had set up the assignment from a very distant place, and then I thought, and then it was like this moment of like, what am I doing to these? What am I doing here? And then that canceling it itself became the pedagogical moment. Actually, it was great, but yeah, it says something about having to be very attentive. I think the presentations talked about this, like everything's in process and sensibilities are changing. So something that might have felt okay to do 10 years ago or 5 years ago might no longer feel or be okay. And I think like we have to be very attentive to that.
Well, this is
I was wondering, Lynn, maybe there's something that you could say about this with regards to your working on, because you've been also working a lot with schools, but also different kinds of students with regards to the colonial neighbors archives and difficult imagery. So maybe you have some experience to share with regards to, and maybe also the evolution of how people react to those images, because Shelley, you just said maybe 5 years ago you could do things differently than you could do now. So maybe because you've been working with these images for such a long time, maybe there's also something that you could add with regards to what has changed, in particular in Germany also.
First of all, I also want to thank you guys for being so open and making yourself vulnerable in regards to, like family, like histories, entanglements, etc. I think it's beautiful. I'm not for safe spaces, but how Hamza Batici says brave spaces. So I welcome that we're open and have a constructive conversation here. And I wanted to also add where Carl mentioned before, this tin, for example, you mentioned the tin and how people are also related to it. And I think the importance of not destroying things in the colonial neighbors archive, as much as I would be up for it, is that people relate to things differently. So people see, for example, this racist can and say, wow, what is this? How come you even have it here? And someone, for example, says, wow, this reminds me of my childhood. I would, at my I don't know, grandmother's aunt, I'll have chocolate out of this can. And it like evokes this emotional connection. And at the same time, you know, like the container of where this can is gives the context of a critical space. So it invites them to also see their family construction in a critical, you know, way without having to interfere. So it's, I think that therefore it's very important, like the context. And I wanted to say I'm very happy that you also, Shelley and Monica, mentioned about, you know, like stepping back from how you would do things and being unsure, because it's beautiful to take someone else's positionality into consideration, and that things are not the same for everyone. And we also say, you know, like different bodies carry different urgencies and different interests, traumas, histories. So not every format works for everybody the same. And therefore we try to interact with like performances or school class formats, etc., because things speak to each other differently. And therefore, so for example, performances are very important for us because we say that our body itself is a site of archive, of undoing knowledge, etc. But we're also not victims of our family histories, you know. So I'm very much for looking backwards to understand how we situated in our own family entanglement histories. But luckily, we have the tool of intervention ourselves in formats like this, or like-minded people, or alliances, etc. And in school classes, it's very easy to situate yourself already like sitting at Savi and not in the institution of a school. Luckily, we are not a museum, so I don't have to oblige and go with rules and regulations. I can design this encounter with young adults the way I want to. And usually the way I initiate it, and you know, the classes are very mixed. And I ask the young adults, for example, what do they, so we have different ways to initiate the coming together, but we ask them, for example, what do they connect with the word Africa? And I ask them to just like wildly ramble words, connotations. And then we tell them, you see, you have this, and then of course you hear things like safari or lion or all kinds of stereotypes. And then we tell them that space, Savi Contemporary, was basically built because it's not them thinking this is Africa. It's the adults telling them that this is Africa. And it's the same adults who told Bonaventure Sobeng Dikung that he can't do the programs the way he wanted them in their spaces, because they said, we are a contemporary space, but we're not a space for African art. And then he wrote this article, if the contemporary is defined by borders. And then they immediately understand what, you know, boundaries are, what preconceptions are, what, and then the stories just flow, because they themselves connect very quickly towards what stories are like pushed on them and how they actually see themselves. And so it's a very different encounter. And I would say, like, we try via like personal stories to connect to the young adults, and less try to kind of like overlayer and tell them a story about decolonial practice. So we always try to bring in a practitioner, like via photography or via an artist that works with the forum theater, the theater of the oppressed, etc., to engage with them, to elaborate, collaborate, and develop something from their own, versus just bombing them with objects and narratives from the archive, but trying to also connect to their stories. Because, you know, even if you're 5 years old, you very much understand the concept of discrimination. And it's very fascinating how people within the museum educational field make programs with colors, for example, to show kids like, what is your preference? Why don't you like this? And how do adults operate, you know, in these moments? So, okay, sorry, I'll stop here because we have 5 minutes before wrapping up.
Yes, exactly, Lynn. Thanks. Alex was so kind to remind us that we kind of slowly wanted to come to a wrap up part, but I think we should use those 5 minutes because it's been so rich, the discussion. I mean, Lynn, thanks for pointing to this again. You know, I wanted to say that what's quite important to us in the book is that, you know, we were dealing the whole time with what archives to choose, and we constantly fell into this strange binary almost automatically of the bad institutions and the good institutions, you know, like the bad big archives, you know, that are problematic and that need to be embarrassed, and the small good archives that are embarrassing others, that are creating this awkwardness. And that was something which we thought wasn't quite right, you know, and because there, you know, there's something difficult about the small archives, small in inverted commas, and there's something really productive about some of the larger, more hegemonic seeming archives that allow us to teach something. And so in some ways, awkwardness also bridges that, because the embarrassment felt by a large institution can lead to something really productive and helpful, you know. So I think there's something very important to be said about not dividing it into good and bad. I think that's what awkwardness allows too. It somehow allows you to use it as a productive heuristic. Just like embarrassment itself can be a productive heuristic and shouldn't be seen as something bad. But maybe there are some other comments, or, I mean, Emily, I know, for example, that we had a really rich discussion based around an incredible object that you brought. I'm not sure if you wanted to start this, because maybe it's a little bit too much, but, you know, I'm just aware that some people may want to share something that they haven't been able to share yet.
Well, I'm not sure there's enough time for me to do that, just as we want to wrap up, but it was just a really useful reflection with Jonas and Sylvia to think through objects that were made by our family members that carry perhaps loaded imagery in them, but that were perhaps also created with an intention that was seemingly innocent or based in a cross-cultural curiosity or inspiration. And so how we negotiate our relationships to those objects that have a personal attachment in that way, in terms of their creation and the intention behind their creation by our family members.
Thanks, for sure. I mean, the reason why I wanted to pick this up is because the module on Colonial Neighbors Archives has an exercise on autoethnography and tries to relate, you know, our own biographies to these objects. And we felt that was so important and is sometimes very painful, as was revealed in our very short discussion.
And maybe it would actually be helpful, since Monica did the same, to just describe the object. It was a box that was made by my grandfather, but painted by my father when he was a teenager, of what I think is a bear, but in the style of Northwest Coast art.
Something that came up, or kind of wrapped up our discussion, Hugo did a kind of really nice, I thought, kind of summary of what we discussed. Was how a similar notion such as awkwardness is how discomfort, we kind of discussed the notion of discomfort and how discomfort can turn into responsibility, and maybe also when I was thinking about the way in which we now discussed, into curatorial responsibility. So how these feelings of discomfort, of feeling awkward, kind of, make yourself act responsibly. And also, Hugo also used the notion of carefulness and care, and that I thought that was a really nice wrap up of when we thought about what can you actually do with this feeling of awkwardness or discomfort, and then turning it into a responsible action was something that I thought was quite nice.
So, you know, in various ways, I think it's for me and Margareta to thank all of you. I mean, you know, I don't know in which first and foremost, but thanks so much for the hospitality, for inviting us to this series, for allowing to present this and discuss it. Thanks to you, Lynn, for being this dialogue partner since so long. This is really just incredibly helpful, and without these kinds of discussions, none of this would exist in some ways. And of course, thanks to all of you for being there and listening. And yeah, like we were saying, pastiche, cut up, rip apart, use the book, do whatever you feel is right to do with a book about awkward archives, and use it. That's really the main point.